When the silence comes from both sides, most people assume the story has finally reached its end. They believe the conflict is over, the emotions have settled, and life quietly moves forward. But that assumption couldn't be further from the truth. Because when communication stops completely, something far more significant begins beneath the surface. One person starts discovering freedom, while the other begins struggling with the one thing they can never truly tolerate: losing control. What looks like peace on the outside often hides a psychological battle that almost no one recognizes. This isn't simply about two people refusing to speak. It's about what happens when someone who depended on your emotional reactions suddenly finds nothing to hold on to anymore. And if you've ever wondered what silence actually does inside the mind of a narcissist, what you're about to understand may completely change the way you see your own healings. Stay with me until the end, because the most important shift isn't what happens to them. It's what quietly begins happening inside you. Once you recognize these psychological patterns, you'll stop questioning yourself, stop searching for explanations they were never capable of giving, and finally understand why silence is often the strongest boundary you can ever create. The first thing that happens after both of you stop reaching out is something I think of as a psychological reset. It doesn't happen through dramatic conversations or emotional confrontations. It happens quietly, beneath the surface, where the narcissist begins trying to make sense of what has changed. For you, remaining silent usually represents something deeply personal. Maybe you've become emotionally exhausted. Maybe you've realized every conversation leads to the same painful cycle. Maybe you've reached the point where protecting your peace matters more than proving your point. Your silence becomes an act of self-preservation. The narcissist, however, rarely interprets your silence that way. Instead of seeing it as a healthy boundary, they treat it like information they need to analyze. Every unanswered message, every day without contact, every absence of emotional reaction becomes another clue they're determined to decode. Their attention immediately shifts toward understanding why their usual influence isn't producing the expected response. Healthy people often reflect on relationships by asking themselves difficult questions. Did I hurt someone? Could I have handled this differently? What can I learn from this experience? A narcissist typically approaches the situation very differently. Their thoughts revolve around strategy rather than accountability. They wonder whether you're trying to teach them a lesson. They question whether someone else has replaced them. They consider whether you're attempting to provoke them or gain the upper hand. Instead of examining their own behavior, they search for an external explanation that protects their self-image. To them, uncertainty feels dangerous. The silence creates a gap they cannot immediately explain, and that uncertainty quietly begins disrupting the sense of control they've always relied upon. That's why many narcissists don't rush to contact you right away. Their silence isn't necessarily acceptance, and it certainly isn't emotional growth. More often, it's observation. They pay attention from a distance. They may check your online activity, notice who interacts with your posts, ask mutual acquaintances indirect questions, or simply wait to see whether you'll eventually return to the familiar pattern they spent so long creating. In their mind, history suggests that sooner or later you'll reach out first, apologize, explain yourself, or reopen the conversation. After all, that's often how the cycle worked before. They've learned to depend on the emotional habits they cultivated inside you: the guilt, the anxiety, the need to fix conflict, the hope that if you just explain yourself one more time, things might finally become different. So at first, they remain patient, not because they've accepted the ending, but because they believe the pattern will repeat itself. But when the silence continues, something begins to change. The confidence they initially felt slowly gives way to curiosity. Curiosity gradually turns into discomfort, and eventually that discomfort begins challenging something much deeper than the relationship itself. It challenges the belief that they still have unlimited access to your attention. For someone whose sense of power has always depended on controlling emotional responses, your continued silence creates something profoundly unsettling. Every additional day without hearing from you quietly weakens the illusion that they still occupy the same place in your emotional world. Meanwhile, something very different is happening inside you. Even if the silence feels painful, confusing, or lonely, it also creates something you've probably been denied for a very long time: space. Space to think without manipulation, space to breathe without anticipating the next conflict, space to remember who you were before every conversation revolved around managing someone else's emotions. That process doesn't happen overnight. In fact, during the beginning, silence often feels uncomfortable because your mind has been conditioned to expect chaos. But beneath that discomfort, something healthier has already begun. Without realizing it, you're taking the very first steps toward reclaiming yourself. And that's exactly why your silence becomes far more powerful than any argument ever could. As the silence stretches on, the emotional experience becomes completely different for each of you. Although you're living through the same absence of communication, you're not living through the same psychological reality. What feels like grief to you often feels like inconvenience to the narcissist. And that difference reveals more about the relationship than anything that was ever said during it. For you, the quiet can feel overwhelming in the beginning. Your mind replays old conversations. You question whether you were too harsh or not patient enough. Some days you may even find yourself missing the person you wish they had been instead of accepting who they repeatedly showed themselves to be. You aren't only grieving the relationship, you're grieving your expectations, your emotional investment, and the version of the future you hoped would eventually exist. That emotional weight is real. You've spent so much time adapting yourself that your identity became tangled with keeping the relationship functioning. You learn to minimize your own needs, choose your words carefully, avoid unnecessary conflict, and constantly monitor the emotional climate around you. Eventually, your nervous system began treating survival as normal. Now that the communication has stopped, your mind is left sorting through everything it never had time to process while you were busy simply trying to get through each day. The narcissist experiences that same silence through an entirely different lens. Instead of mourning the emotional connection, they notice the interruption of something they had grown accustomed to receiving. Your attention, your reassurance, your reactions, your willingness to explain yourself, even your frustration, became part of a system that consistently reinforced their sense of importance. When that supply suddenly disappears, they don't immediately sit with sadness or self-reflection. Their first response is usually much simpler. They notice that something they expected to be available is no longer there. Rather than thinking, "I wonder how much pain they were carrying," they're far more likely to think, "Why aren't they responding anymore?" The focus remains on access instead of empathy. That's because narcissistic thinking isn't centered around mutual emotional understanding. It's centered around maintaining influence. As long as they could predict your reactions, they felt secure. They understood which words would trigger guilt, which behaviors would keep you engaged, and which emotional buttons would eventually pull you back into the familiar cycle. Silence interrupts that predictability. Without feedback, they lose the ability to measure where they stand in your emotional world. That uncertainty gradually becomes uncomfortable because control depends on knowing how someone else will respond. Meanwhile, something important begins happening inside you, even if you don't recognize it yet. Every day you remain outside the cycle, your perspective becomes a little clearer. You begin remembering conversations that once left you confused, but now suddenly make sense. Behaviors you once excused begin looking different. Excuses that sounded convincing during the relationship start losing their power once you're no longer emotionally trapped inside the environment that created them. Distance has a remarkable way of revealing what constant exposure often hides. At first, you may still miss them. Then you begin missing the idea of them. Eventually, you realize what you truly miss is the hope that things would somehow become different. That realization is painful, but it's also incredibly freeing. While you're slowly reconnecting with reality, the narcissist often becomes increasingly aware that something isn't unfolding according to the script they expected. The emotional habits they relied on are no longer producing familiar results. You aren't chasing. You aren't defending yourself. You aren't trying to repair what only one person was willing to fix. For someone who depended on emotional access to maintain a sense of control, that shift becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. This is why prolonged silence often affects them far more deeply than emotional confrontation ever did. Arguments still keep them involved in your emotional world. Anger still confirms they matter. Even disappointment proves they're occupying your thoughts. But silence removes the audience. It quietly communicates something words never could, that your emotional energy is no longer revolving around them. And for someone whose identity depends heavily on remaining at the center of other people's attention, that absence creates a level of uncertainty they cannot easily regulate. While they're trying to understand why their usual influence isn't working anymore, you're slowly discovering something much more valuable. You're beginning to understand that peace doesn't come from finally changing them. It comes from no longer allowing their behavior to define your emotional life. That shift is subtle, it's slow, sometimes it's almost invisible, but it's the moment real healing quietly begins. As the silence continues, something much deeper begins unfolding beneath the surface. What started as a lack of communication slowly transforms into a direct challenge to the narcissist's sense of identity. This isn't simply about whether you call, text, or respond. It's about what your absence silently communicates to someone who has always measured their worth through control. To understand why silence affects them so intensely, you first have to understand how they experience relationships. Healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, trust, and emotional reciprocity. Both people influence one another, support one another, and recognize each other's independence. A narcissist rarely experiences relationships through that lens. Instead, relationships become systems of influence. The question isn't, how do we grow together? The question becomes, how much access do I still have to this person's emotions? As long as they can predict your reactions, they feel powerful. Whether you respond with love, frustration, guilt, fear, or anger almost doesn't matter. Every emotional response reassures them that they still occupy space inside your mind. Your silence changes that equation completely. The moment you stop explaining yourself, they lose information. The moment you stop defending yourself, they lose leverage. The moment you stop reacting, they lose confirmation that they can still shape your emotional world. That's why silence often unsettles them far more than confrontation ever could. An argument keeps the connection alive. Even conflict maintains emotional contact. Every heated conversation reminds them they still have influence. Silence removes that certainty. Without emotional feedback, they're left confronting something they've spent years avoiding, the possibility that their control is no longer working. This is where their internal dialogue often becomes distorted. Instead of accepting that you've chosen peace, they begin creating explanations that protect their ego. They may convince themselves you're trying to manipulate them. They may assume you're attempting to make them jealous or force them into chasing you. Some even interpret your silence as a competition they refuse to lose. Rarely do they arrive at the simplest explanation, that you're exhausted, that you've stopped participating in a cycle that continually damaged your well-being, that you've finally realized Protecting your mental health matters more than winning another impossible conversation. Accepting those possibilities would require accountability, and accountability threatens the image they've carefully constructed of themselves. So instead, they rewrite the story. Perhaps they tell themselves you've become selfish. Perhaps they decide you've been influenced by someone else. Perhaps they convince themselves you've always been the difficult one. These narratives aren't created because they're accurate. They're created because the truth feels too uncomfortable to face. If they admitted your silence was the result of repeated emotional harm, they'd also have to acknowledge their own role in creating that outcome. For someone whose self-image depends on feeling superior, that realization becomes psychologically intolerable. This is why your silence slowly becomes a mirror. Not a mirror reflecting your weaknesses, but one exposing their insecurities. Every day you remain emotionally unavailable forces them to face uncertainty they cannot immediately eliminate. They wonder whether you've changed. They question whether someone else now occupies the attention they once expected to receive. They begin realizing they can no longer predict your decisions with the confidence they once had. That uncertainty gradually weakens the illusion of control they've depended upon. Ironically, while they're becoming increasingly preoccupied with understanding your silence, you're becoming less consumed by them. The emotional fog begins lifting. You stop analyzing every conversation. You stop searching for hidden meanings behind every message. You stop carrying responsibility for emotions that never belonged to you in the first place. Slowly, your attention returns to your own life, your own goals, your own peace, your own identity. For the narcissist, however, that shift feels deeply threatening, not because you've become cruel, not because you've become distant, but because you've become emotionally independent. And emotional independence is something they cannot easily control. This is often the turning point. The confidence they projected in the beginning slowly gives way to frustration. Frustration becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes anxiety. Because the one person they believed would always remain emotionally available is no longer responding according to the script they spent so long writing. Your silence hasn't defeated them. It has simply removed the stage on which they performed. Without constant access to your emotions, they can no longer reinforce the identity they built around influence and control. Meanwhile, every day you remain committed to your boundary strengthens something inside you that manipulation slowly tried to erase. Your confidence returns. Your judgment becomes clearer. Your emotional stability begins replacing constant self-doubt. And perhaps for the first time in a very long while, your life stops revolving around someone else's need for power and starts revolving around your own freedom. As more time passes without contact, the silence begins creating pressure the narcissist never expected. What once felt temporary now starts feeling uncertain. The confidence they had in your eventual return slowly begins to weaken, and when that happens, they rarely remain passive for long. This is the stage where many of their familiar behaviors begin to reappear, not because they've suddenly developed insight, not because they've experienced genuine emotional growth, but because the absence of your attention has become increasingly difficult for them to tolerate. When they realize they're no longer controlling the direction of the relationship, they often begin searching for ways to pull you back into their emotional orbit. One of the most common strategies is something many people refer to as hoovering. Despite how emotional it may appear, hoovering isn't necessarily about love. It's about restoring access. If enough time passes without hearing from you, they may suddenly reach out with unexpected kindness. The message might sound warm, reflective, or surprisingly vulnerable. They may tell you they've been thinking about you, admit they've made mistakes, or say they finally understand everything now. Sometimes they'll remind you of your happiest memories together. Sometimes they'll speak as though nothing serious ever happened. Other times, they'll present themselves as someone who has completely changed. At first glance, these moments can feel incredibly convincing. After all, they're finally saying the words you've wanted to hear for so long. But it's important to ask a different question. What changed? Was it genuine self awareness? Or was it simply the realization that their usual influence was no longer working? Real accountability doesn't appear only after losing access to someone. It appears through consistent responsibility, lasting behavioral change, and a willingness to accept consequences without expecting immediate forgiveness. Hoovering often focuses on restoring the relationship before earning back trust. The goal isn't necessarily emotional intimacy, the goal is reopening the door. If warmth and affection don't produce the reaction they're hoping for, many narcissists gradually shift toward another strategy. Instead of inviting you back, they attempt to provoke you. This is where baiting begins. Baiting doesn't require affection, it only requires a response. They may send a message designed to irritate you. They may make subtle accusations, sarcastic comments, or dismissive remarks they know will trigger old emotional wounds. Some choose to post carefully selected content online, hoping you'll notice and react. Others intentionally create confusion, knowing uncertainty often tempts people into breaking their silence. From their perspective, even negative attention is still attention. An angry reply confirms they're still affecting you. A defensive explanation reassures them they're still occupying space inside your thoughts. A long emotional message tells them they still have influence. That's why refusing to react can become so powerful. Silence doesn't simply ignore the manipulation. It interrupts the psychological reward they're seeking. When baiting fails to produce results, another pattern often begins emerging. Instead of focusing entirely on you, they introduce someone else into the emotional equation. This is the foundation of triangulation. Suddenly, there's a new relationship everyone is supposed to notice. A mysterious person appears in their social media posts. Stories begin circulating through mutual friends. Comments are made that subtly compare you to someone else. Sometimes they exaggerate how happy they are. Other times, they quietly suggest that someone else appreciates them more than you ever did. None of this is accidental. The purpose isn't authentic connection. The purpose is emotional pressure. They want you questioning yourself. They want you wondering whether you've been replaced. They want you comparing your worth against someone you've never even met. Because once self-doubt returns, they hope the old emotional patterns will return with it. The strategy isn't designed to build a healthy relationship with someone new. It's designed to regain psychological control over the person who walked away. Understanding this changes everything. Hoovering, baiting, triangulation. Although they look different on the surface, they all serve the same purpose. Each one attempts to restore emotional access that silence has taken away. Each one tries to rebuild a sense of control that no longer feels secure. And each one depends on the same thing: your participation. Without your emotional reaction, these strategies begin losing their effectiveness. That doesn't mean they immediately stop. In fact, they may briefly become more intense. When old methods fail, people who rely on manipulation often try harder before they finally accept that the pattern is no longer working. This is why maintaining your boundary can feel so difficult. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because you're disrupting a dynamic that once depended on your predictable responses. Every moment you refuse to be pulled back into the cycle, you're teaching your mind something entirely new. You no longer have to explain yourself to protect your value. You no longer have to defend your boundaries to justify them. And you no longer have to participate in emotional games simply because someone else insists on playing them. That realization quietly shifts the balance of power. Not because you've gained control over them, but because they've lost control over you. If the silence continues, something remarkable begins to happen, but not all at once. There isn't a single morning when you wake up completely healed. There isn't one conversation that suddenly erases every painful memory. Recovery unfolds quietly, almost unnoticed, through countless small moments that slowly reconnect you with yourself. For a long time, your mind and body may struggle to trust the quiet. That isn't because you're weak. It's because you've spent so much time living in an environment where emotional unpredictability became normal. You learned to read subtle changes in mood. You monitored facial expressions, carefully measured your words, and constantly tried to prevent the next conflict before it even began. Eventually, your nervous system adapted to survival. Even during peaceful moments, your body stayed prepared for another emotional storm. That constant state of alertness doesn't disappear the moment communication ends. At first, the silence may actually feel uncomfortable. You may find yourself checking your phone without thinking. You may replay conversations repeatedly, searching for answers you'll never receive. Some days you'll question whether you made the right decision. Other days you'll wonder whether they ever cared at all. These reactions don't mean you're moving backward. They simply reflect a nervous system that has spent months, or even years, learning to expect instability. Healing begins when your body slowly realizes that it no longer has to live in that state. Little by little, the constant tension begins to fade. Your breathing becomes calmer. Your thoughts become less scattered. Sleep slowly becomes more restorative. The overwhelming mental noise starts giving way to moments of genuine stillness. For the first time in a long time, your mind isn't occupied with predicting someone else's behavior. Instead, it begins paying attention to your own needs. You rediscover interests you abandoned. You reconnect with people you unintentionally drifted away from. You start making decisions based on what feels healthy instead of what prevents conflict. None of these changes happen overnight, but together they represent something incredibly powerful. You're no longer surviving, you're rebuilding. Meanwhile, the narcissist often experiences the exact opposite. The silence that gradually brings you clarity continues creating uncertainty for them. Without your emotional responses reinforcing their sense of importance, they lose one of the external sources they depended on to regulate themselves. They may continue convincing themselves they don't care. They may appear confident to everyone around them. They may even project an image of moving on effortlessly. But appearances are not the same as internal reality. Without consistent emotional validation, the certainty they once projected often begins giving way to restlessness. Questions they cannot answer continue lingering. Why didn't you come back? Why aren't their usual tactics working? Why does your absence feel different this time? The more they search for certainty outside themselves, the more unstable everything begins to feel. Because external control can never create lasting internal security. That has always been the hidden weakness beneath the confidence they tried so hard to display. You, on the other hand, begin discovering something far more sustainable. Instead of depending on someone else's approval, you slowly begin trusting your own judgment again. Instead of measuring your worth by how someone treats you, you begin recognizing that your value was never theirs to define. Instead of constantly walking on eggshells, you start experiencing relationships that no longer require fear to maintain them. That transformation is the true purpose of the silence. It was never about punishing them. It was never about making them miss you. It was never about winning some invisible battle. It was about creating enough distance to hear your own voice again. Because healing doesn't happen when the narcissist finally understands what they did. Healing begins when you stop waiting for that understanding altogether. The closure you've been searching for doesn't arrive through one final conversation. It arrives through acceptance. Acceptance that some people will never take responsibility. Acceptance that not every question receives an answer, acceptance that your peace is worth protecting, even if someone else refuses to understand it. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: silence is not empty. Silence is where your identity begins returning. It's where your confidence quietly rebuilds. It's where your nervous system finally learns that safety is possible again. Most importantly, it's where you discover that freedom was never found in changing another person. It was found in choosing yourself. When that realization finally settles into your heart, the silence no longer feels lonely. It feels like peace. And that peace is something no manipulative person can ever take away from you again.